All right, so you ready for this? We're going deep on David Ferrie.
Oh, this is gonna be good.
He's one of those guys you just can't really talk about without bringing up, Lee Harvey Oswald.
And the JFK assassination. It's like a tangled web.
Right, a tangled web. And we've got some excerpts from a journal here, all dedicated to JFK assassination research, and boy, it's a wild ride.
What makes Ferry so fascinating is, well, he's this mass of contradictions, truly eccentric.
No kidding. I mean, where do we even begin with this guy? He had alopecia. Can you imagine? Back then, socially, that must have been incredibly tough.
Oh, absolutely. Back in the mid-20th century, people weren't nearly as understanding about physical differences, alopecia especially. It was often misunderstood.
Totally. And he tried to become a priest, a Catholic priest,
Yeah.
multiple times. But it never quite worked out. I feel like he was constantly searching for something, trying to find where he fit in.
That's a good point. I mean, understanding this context really helps us see the challenges that Ferry faced early on, right? And maybe it sheds some light on the choices he made later in life.
Like finding that sense of belonging in the military. He
Exactly.
joined the Army Reserve and then the Civil Air Patrol, the CAP. And get this, Lee Harvey Oswald
Oh, yeah.
was in the same CAP unit. Crazy.
It is. Although the stories about how much they interacted, they're all over the place. Some say close, some say barely knew each other. But what's interesting is the potential impact, the impact that these paramilitary groups had on people like Ferry and Oswald. These groups tend to attract individuals with a strong sense of patriotism, of course, but also those who might have, anti-establishment views or maybe a fascination with weapons and strategy. It can be a breeding ground for some pretty intense ideologies.
Makes you wonder what kind of conversations were happening back then at those CAP meetings. What were they being exposed to?
Right.
And then Ferry's story takes another turn, right? He gets deeply involved with anti-Castro Cuban exile groups. We're talking 50s and 60s. Cuba was a political powder keg.
Oh, absolutely. The Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro rising to power, created this massive wave of Cuban exiles, fiercely opposed to the communist regime. Many of these groups, they were driven by this intense desire to overthrow Castro, and they often had ties to U.S. intelligence agencies. They were looking for any support they could get.
Like straight out of a spy thriller, right?
Yeah.
Ferry starts work with this guy, Edward Yobel, flying missions for some pretty big names in the Cuban exile community. Even Carlos Marcello, the infamous New Orleans mob boss.
You can imagine. The seemingly ordinary pilot rubbing shoulders with revolutionaries and organized crime figures. It's wild.
It's crazy, and it just highlights how tangled the web of alliances and motivations was around Cuba back then. Exile groups, U.S. intelligence agencies, even organized crime figures, all mixed up in this fight against Castro.
Murky world, covert operations. The line between legitimate political action and criminal activity got incredibly blurry.
And Ferry's right in the thick of it.
Yeah.
But then things get even stranger. We start looking at his connection to this group, the Friends of Democratic Cuba.
Yeah.
They allegedly had ties to the CIA, and this shadowy figure named Guy Bannister, ex-FBI agent, ran his own private detective agency.
What's fascinating here is how plausible Ferry's involvement in these covert operations actually seems. The Friends of Democratic Cuba, they were involved in some very shady activities, including a truck purchase under the names Joseph Moore and, get this, Oswald. Remember, this is years before the assassination.
Wow.
But the fact that the name Oswald pops up here, connected to Ferry, it's just incredibly odd.
Chills.
Yeah.
Literal chills.
Yeah.
And there's more. Ferry was reportedly involved in a training camp at Lake Pontchartrain, supposedly for Cuban exiles, but some accounts suggest the camp had a much darker purpose, potentially linked to the CIA's anti-Castro operations.
Wow.
It's like peeling back layers of an onion.
And each layer gets more unsettling.
Right, it's unsettling. So then the question becomes, what was Ferry's actual role in all of this? Was he just a dedicated anti-communist who got caught up in something way over his head, or was he a more active player in something far more sinister? The evidence we have it's circumstantial, but the connections, the coincidences, they're undeniable.
Absolutely.
And these connections start to catch up with him. His personal life, it starts to unravel. He's facing mounting legal troubles, charges related to his relationships with young men, and his behavior. It becomes increasingly erratic.
These legal problems, they're significant because they expose Ferry's vulnerabilities. He was becoming desperate. He turns to Guy Bannister for legal help, further solidifying his connection to this underworld network. And then there's the link to Carlos Marchella's lawyer, G. Ray Gill Sr. It's like he's being pulled deeper and deeper into this world of secrets and shady dealings.
And then we have the Clinton incident. And this is where things really start to heat up in terms of the JFK assassination conspiracy theories. Multiple witnesses place Ferry, Oswald, Andy Clay Shaw, prominent New Orleans businessmen, together in Clinton, Louisiana, just a few months before the assassination.
Yeah, the Clinton incident is crucial because it directly connects Ferry and Oswald to Clay Shaw, who would later be accused by Jim Garrison of being involved in a CIA plot to assassinate Kennedy. The reason for their meeting in Clinton, it remains a mystery. But the fact that these three figures were together, especially considering Shaw's alleged CIA connections, it's incredibly significant.
And the mystery, it deepens even further after the assassination. Ferry stays involved in Marcella's legal defense, and his actions in the days surrounding Kennedy's death are, to put it mildly, suspicious. And then there's this string of deaths all connected to Ferry. Guy Bannister dies from what's initially called a heart attack, Edward Yobel is found brutally murdered, and Dr. Mary Stultz Sherman, cancer researcher who knew Ferry, is found stabbed and burned to death in her apartment. It's a chilling pattern.
The deaths surrounding Ferry are deeply unsettling. While some could be explained away as natural causes or unrelated criminal activity, the timing and circumstances are hard to ignore. Were these just coincidences, or were they attempts to silence people who knew too much? It's a question that continues to haunt this entire story.
And then, of course, there's Ferry's own death in 1967, found dead in his apartment, and the whole scene is, well, bizarre, to say the least.
Let's go back and look at those details. Ferry was found face down in his bed, covered by a sheet. There were 2 typed suicide notes near his body. One, addressed to Al, was full of bitter accusations and included the line, "When you receive this, I will be quite dead, so no inquest will be possible."
The other note, it was more philosophical, kind of reflecting on life's meaninglessness. But both notes, including the signatures, were typed, which is pretty unusual for a suicide note, wouldn't you say?
Incredibly unusual. It definitely raises questions about whether those notes were genuine, whether Ferry actually wrote them himself.
And even though there were these notes, the coroner, Dr. Nicholas Chetta, ruled Ferry's death as being from natural causes. He attributed it to a cerebral hemorrhage caused by a ruptured berry aneurysm. But even Dr. Chetta seemed uncertain about the exact time of death. Initially, he placed it before midnight on February 21st, but later changed it to sometime after 2 a.m. on February 22nd.
The inconsistencies surrounding Ferry's death are really troubling. The typed suicide notes, the coroner's uncertainty about the time of death, and the fact that Ferry was in a highly agitated state in the days leading up to his death, all of these things point to the possibility of foul play.
It feels like the more you dig into Ferry's story, the more questions you end up with. Was he a patsy? A pawn in some larger game? Or did he know too much and become a liability? It's really hard to say for sure. But one thing's for certain, David Ferry was a complex and enigmatic figure who played a significant, if ambiguous, role in the events surrounding the JFK assassination. His connections to Oswald, the Cuban exile community, organized crime, and potentially even intelligence agencies put him right at the heart of the conspiracy theories that still swirl around this tragic event.
Exactly. His life reads like a spy thriller, full of intrigue, double crosses, and untimely deaths. And his death, which is still shrouded in mystery, only adds to the enigma. It's a story that continues to fascinate and frustrate researchers to this day.
So we were talking about those mysterious deaths surrounding Ferry. And before we get back to Ferry's own death, I want to circle back to the Clinton incident for a second.
Yeah.
It just feels like such a crucial piece of this whole puzzle, especially when you consider what we know about the political landscape back then.
Absolutely. I mean, we can't forget 1963, civil rights movement was in full swing. That voter registration drive in Clinton, Louisiana, it was a direct challenge to the Jim Crow South. It was volatile. Tensions were high.
So what does it mean to have Ferry, Oswald, and Clay Shaw, all figures with links to anti-Castro activities and possibly even intelligence agencies present at this event? It seems so out of place.
Yeah.
Unless there was some deeper agenda at play.
Right, exactly. One theory is that they were there to disrupt the voter registration drive, maybe at the behest of those who wanted to maintain, segregation. Another theory is that they were trying to to infiltrate or gather intelligence on civil rights groups.
It's like they were operating in this shadowy world, almost parallel to the main events of the civil rights movement. Makes you wonder how much their activities might have intersected with or even influenced the struggle for racial equality.
That's a really interesting point. It's certainly possible that their involvement in anti-Castro activities and their potential ties to intelligence agencies could have, brought them into contact with groups or individuals opposed to the civil rights movement.
And this kind of brings us back to that question of Ferry's motivations.
Right.
I mean, was he driven purely by anti-communism, or was there something more to it? Was he susceptible to extremist ideologies, or was he a more calculated player in a larger game?
To understand Ferry, I think we have to remember those early life experiences. The challenges he faced with his alopecia, his struggles to become a priest. Those experiences, I think, they could have really shaped his worldview, made him more receptive to groups that offered a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose.
Right, like he was searching for acceptance, validation, and maybe these groups, with their strict hierarchies and ideologies, provided him with that structure.
That's a very plausible explanation. And then, when you add in his fascination with the military and paramilitary activities, his deep dive into the world of Cuban exiles, covert operations, it paints a portrait of a man drawn to power, drawn to intrigue.
And it's within this world of power and intrigue that this string of mysterious deaths unfolds. And it starts with Guy Bannister, right? Ferry's associate, key figure in the New Orleans underworld. His death in June 1964, initially attributed to a heart attack. But the circumstances surrounding it have always been, well, they've always been suspicious.
Bannister had a long history with both intelligence agencies and organized crime. Former FBI agent went on to establish his own private detective agency. Some believe he was involved in various covert operations, gun running to Cuba, potentially even the JFK assassination plot itself.
So when he dies suddenly, just months after the assassination, it raises a lot of red flags, right? I mean, was he silenced to prevent him from revealing what he knew?
It's certainly a possibility. Bannister's death, it removed a potentially crucial source of information about Ferry and his activities. And it's not the only death connected to Ferry that raises questions.
Right. There's the brutal murder of Edward Yobel in February 1964, the pilot who flew missions with Ferry for the Cuban exile groups, and his death, it was never solved.
Yobel had reportedly expressed fears for his safety in the months leading up to his death. He believed he was being followed, harassed, and he had information about Ferry's activities, particularly their involvement with the Cuban exiles and their potential connections to U.S. intelligence agencies.
So not a stretch to think that he might have been silenced, to prevent him from talking. And then there's the chilling case of Dr. Mary Stultz Sherman, a respected cancer researcher who knew Ferry. She was found stabbed and burned to death in her apartment in July 1964. Again, no one was ever charged with her murder.
Dr. Sherman's death is particularly disturbing because of the brutality involved. I mean, it suggests a deliberate attempt to not only kill her, but to send a message. And it just deepens the web of mystery surrounding Ferry and his connections.
And these deaths, they create this almost suffocating atmosphere of paranoia and fear. It's like something out of a Cold War spy thriller. It makes you wonder if Ferry himself felt that same sense of dread, knowing the kind of people he was associated with, the secrets he might have been privy to.
It's a valid question. I mean, Ferry was clearly living a life on the edge, moving in these circles of extremism, conspiracy, violence. It's not hard to imagine that he might have felt trapped or even threatened by the very world he'd become a part of.
And that brings us to the final chapter of Ferry's story. His own death in February 1967. Found dead in his apartment, 2 typed suicide notes near his body.
Mm-hmm.
But the circumstances surrounding his death have always been highly contested.
The suicide notes themselves are curious. As we discussed earlier, they were both typed, which is unusual for a suicide note. And the content of the notes, particularly the one addressed to Al, raises more questions than it answers.
Right. The language is very accusatory, almost as if Ferry is trying to expose someone or something, even his final act. And then there's the coroner's conclusion of natural causes. Despite the conflicting evidence and the general air of suspicion surrounding the whole case,
The inconsistencies in the coroner's report, the uncertainty about the time of death, the presence of those type suicide notes, all of these factors contribute to the belief that Ferry's death might not have been a suicide at all.
It's almost as if his death became a final act of defiance, a way to posthumously cast doubt on the official narrative and
Well,
to ensure that the questions surrounding his life and his connections would linger long after he was gone. Yeah, it's like Ferry's death, suicide or not, it's almost like it's this final piece of a puzzle, but
yeah.
instead of making things clearer, it just makes the whole picture, I don't know, more distorted somehow.
I know what you mean. It adds this whole other layer of complexity to a story that was already incredibly complicated. And it brings us right back to that central question, right? Was Ferry just an eccentric who got swept up in events way beyond his control, or was he a more active player in something bigger, something more conspiratorial?
I mean, it's a question people have been debating for decades, and honestly, after looking at all this material, I don't think there's a simple answer.
I agree. I don't think there is. But what we can do is we can look at the evidence, we can analyze the connections, and we can try to understand Ferry's motivations, as best as we can. And I think what's striking is that even if we completely set aside the possibility of Ferry being directly involved in Kennedy's assassination, his links to Oswald, to Bannister, Yobel, Shaw, Marcello, they all put him in a position where he could have had knowledge of what happened.
So he was at least a witness to history, right? Maybe even a witness to a cover-up.
Exactly.
And then you can't help but wonder, I mean, was that ultimately what made him a liability?
That is a chilling thought, isn't it? That knowing too much, being connected to these powerful, these dangerous figures, that might have ultimately cost Ferry his life.
I know. It's what makes his story so captivating, I think. It forces you to confront the darker side of history, the possibility that the official narrative, it might not be the whole truth.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Ferry's life, his death, they challenge us to question, to dig deeper, to never settle for those simple answers, those easy answers. They remind us that history is often, it's messy, it's ambiguous, and it's full of these unanswered questions.
And that's the beauty of a deep dive like this, isn't it? I mean, it's not about finding all the answers. It's about exploring the complexities, wrestling with those uncertainties, and maybe, just maybe, coming away with a deeper understanding of the forces at play, the forces that shape our world.
Absolutely. And in Ferry's case, I think it's about acknowledging that his story, for all its strangeness and its intrigue, it's a reminder of the human cost of secrecy, of power, and the enduring search for truth.
Well said. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the life of David Ferry, I want to leave with this. What do you think Ferry's legacy is? Is he just a footnote in history? Is he a cautionary tale, or is he something more? Think about it, and let's continue the conversation. Thanks for joining us.